All right, assuming I've figured out how YouTube works now, I'm now live. So, welcome back. It's been a while. I am Greg Farrar, and this is my not even close to daily COVID-19 trends live stream. I will cover the countries of the world, followed by, in the second section, the states of the United States, and in the third section, the counties of California. So let's just dive right in. I thought I had this one up already, but apparently not. So I'm going to load the countries report here. And you can see these graphs yourself at gregfarrar.us. Gregfarrar.us will let you browse these. They're dynamic. You can click on things to focus on a particular region or several or compare or whatever you like. So let's start with severity. Severity, again, is my own metric that attempts to capture how bad the epidemic is in a particular region. Severity, severity combines daily cases per million, which is to say the number of cases that are reported per 1 million population. Since it's adjusted by population, it allows this DCPM number to be compared between regions. DCPM, oh, well, let me select it. It says at the top of the graph, though, DCPM, daily cases per million. So we can compare countries to states, or counties to countries, or countries to countries. All of them can be compared because it's adjusted by population. If we look at the current severity of the countries of the world, and by the way, you can ask questions in the text chat, the live chat. I should see those if you do that. If you look at the countries of the world, right now, according to the list on the right, the legend, Belgium is the worst. And that's the red line here. You might look at this and say, well, Belgium isn't really the worst. They've suddenly burst into the worst. But really the recent problems have been Bahrain, which just never seems to be able to get over this thing. Bahrain, you can see the purple line, has just had months of being near the top, near the worst. Used to be Qatar and Bahrain, neighbors, were co-equal in their worstness. But now Bahrain, Qatar died away. I actually haven't looked at Qatar for a while. Let's just take a quick look to see. Where is Qatar? It used to be consistently the worst in the world. And then it wasn't. Yeah, and so here's Qatar down in the 70s. It's not even a warm spot anymore. Not over it yet. 70 is not great. We'd like to see 10 daily cases per million. But 70 at least is, it's certainly well below the 1,000 that Qatar had at its worst. And if it's below 100, it means if it's just barely below 100, it means the region hasn't gotten over it. It still has a simmering problem, but it's not explosive. Unlike, for instance, Israel. Israel here has an explosive problem. It was up to 1,000 again. That's just an enormous severity. We seldom see severity that high. Over 200 is a hot spot in severity. And so here this is 5 times the cutoff for being severe. Israel is extraordinarily severe, or at least it was a week ago. Now Israel's been plummeting in severity, so probably it's heading towards a better place. And that's then what has allowed Belgium to catch it. And Belgium is the worst in the world right now. And that's this European epicenter we're seeing now. Europe is back, and you can see quite a few of these things here. France, Spain, Belgium, Netherlands, quite a few of these, United Kingdom, Czech Republic, are actually in Europe. So this lowest line here, I'll just zoom in so we can see. So we're looking at just the ones that are hot spots. We have a fair number of hotspots in the world, not a huge number. There are 100 plus countries in the world, 200 something, almost 200, but only less than 20 of them are hotspots. The really bad ones are Belgium, Czech Republic, Israel, United Kingdom, and the Netherlands, which has just got Europe written all over it. All of those except for Israel. And then Jordan, interestingly, says we kind of have a Middle East or Israel cluster going on here, which hasn't usually been a problem. Moldova, Armenia, Argentina, a lingering relic of the Central South America cluster, which before Europe caught fire again, Central South America was the problem. Argentina is still there, but getting slightly better. And you notice Brazil, for instance, is nowhere to be seen. Central South America has largely gotten better, and then a few down at the bottom here. But Europe is really the news of this graph. Europe is severely hit. If we look, however, at growth, one of my favorite graphs is the growth graph. It gives us a sense of where all these are headed. It's one thing if you have 1,000 severity and you're climbing. Severity includes to some degree whether you're climbing or not. But anyway, if you can have 1,000 severity if you're not climbing, if you have a huge number of cases. But this graph simply shows where we're headed. So there's a big difference between having, let's forget about severity for a moment, having 100 daily cases per million with a very rapid growth rate and 100 daily cases per million where it's shrinking quickly. This graph shows where who's rising and who's shrinking. And here again, of the top 20, most of them are shrinking, and some of them pretty alarmingly. Anything over 20%, the weekly growth rate, 20% per week, is really pretty bad. And so we have about 8 of them here that are bad. United Kingdom is extremely bad at 80% weekly growth rate. And not clearly dropping either. It's shot up to there and it's kind of leveled off. Slovakia has been worse and seems to be getting better, but is still in the 70s. Belgium has this sort of wave to it. We can look at it separately for a moment, where it was above 60 and then it seemed like it might get better and now it's back to 60. All of these numbers though are very bad. You can't look at even a 30% growth rate and say that's anything but bad. It's just a question of how bad, and the answer right now is even worse than it was a couple weeks ago. So Belgium is really in the middle of a growth spurt. Just for kicks though, let's take a look at, as a way of comparing, again, if somebody has a 60% growth rate, but they only have 10 cases in the whole country, they can go from 10 to 16 in a week, and that's a 60% growth rate, but it's nothing to really be worried about. It's just the very beginning of an epidemic. The question is, how's Belgium doing in daily cases per million? Does it have few cases, or does it have a lot? And as we can see from this graph, this is the daily cases per million for Belgium. It's a hot spot in daily cases per million at almost 300. Not ridiculously hot, but 200 being the cutoff. This is a solid hot spot, Belgium. And as we saw, it's a really hot spot in growth rate. So Belgium has everything that we don't want to see. Belgium is hit very hard right now with a large number of cases and a sustained and accelerating growth. Now, where was my graph? Okay. Yeah, and in fact, to make this particular graph, this is only the hottest DCPM countries, the ones with the highest number of cases adjusted for population. To even make this graph, you have to have a fair number of cases. So this isn't going to show that 10 cases to 16 cases country, because they don't have enough cases to show up in the top 20 daily cases per million. So this is one of my favorite graphs because it does pick out just those that are already really hard hit in terms of daily cases. And then it says, where are they headed? Are they going above, or going up or down? We've had times when the hardest hit countries are pretty much all dropping, but this is not one of those times. Here's the white line. Somewhere near the bottom is, you see this horizontal white line, that's the 0 line. Any country currently above that line and its rightmost tip is growing, and any country below is shrinking. And there are maybe only 6 of the 20 that are shrinking. The rest are growing, some of them not by too much. But then there are some that are really growing, and the United Kingdom is actually looking the worst of all this bunch with its 80% growth rate. But Belgium, yeah, so Europe is just looking bad. Netherlands, 45% weekly growth, way above that 20% cutoff to consider it a problem. Armenia, 44%. Czech Republic, Moldova, just do remind myself that Moldova really is in Europe. Yes, it is. Moldova, Lebanon is not in Europe. It's more, there's something Middle Eastern happening here as well. But certainly the big news is Europe. Europe is very hard hit right now. Lots of countries, lots of cases. And in the beginning, by the way, just to go back to the beginning, I wonder if we have Italy somewhere here. Back in the beginning, when I first started reporting, it was actually before I started reporting, there was all this craze around how terrible things were in Italy. And when I looked back the other week, I was surprised to find that Italy had never actually become a warm spot by my definition. It had never reached 100 daily cases per million. Where is Italy? Oh, I see. Yeah, and this is exactly the reason Italy isn't in this graph. This is a graph that shows countries that became warm spots and then what happened afterwards. There are a lot of countries that became warm spots, but Italy never did. And so that whole panic that was happening about how bad Italy was, well, there are all these countries have now outdone that early wave in Italy. It doesn't even count as a wave. It was a ripple. I don't know if I'm going to have a graph to show that here, but let's just see. Yeah, actually, that is the graph to show that. Here's Italy. And Italy, which, again, never reached 100, compare that with something like the United States. Actually, the United States isn't even that great an example because the United States has never had it bad either as a whole. But if you compare it to the United States also didn't reach 100 at the time, but did become briefly a hot spot. But Italy is just a non, it doesn't register among the hardest hit countries. Now, though, you see it's starting to peak up there above the 50 line. It got really good for a while, 3 daily cases per million. That is really good. It got over it. But Europe as a whole is losing its grip on the epidemic right now. And Italy is being pulled into that as well. And it is perfectly possible to imagine, especially from the shape of this graph, that Italy is heading in the direction of, say, Spain. That's what Spain did. Spain also, one of the early ones, one of the earliest waves when in Europe, Spain did go well above 100, also very much got over it, and now is back in force at well above 200. So again, Europe, very hard hit, continues to be very hard hit. That's the main news of the countries segment. And I think I'm just going to, well, let's just take a look at the world as a whole. Somewhere here I've got world as a whole. Did this show it? All right, this shows it. Just to get some perspective here. This is the daily, somewhat confusingly. This is the earlier version of the graphs that I used to do, where all these blue background graphs with dots and curved trend lines and showing daily growth rates. The daily growth rate for the world right now is under 0.5%. It grows 0.5% a day. So that's 3-4% in a week. That's not bad. It is growing, but it's stable at this rather low number. Now, to convert that to the numbers we were talking before, the weekly numbers, again, 20% is a bad number weekly. So 3% is a bad number daily. And so this at less than 0.5%, the world as a whole is doing pretty well. It's still growing, and by no means is it getting over it. It's not back in the realm where it was shrinking and shrinking and shrinking at a very quick pace back in August. The European cluster and some of the new growth in the United States has just barely pulled the world as a whole back to positive growth. But some days it doesn't. You can see a few that are negative. And some areas are doing just fine, like Asia, and then some aren't. And so when you throw it all together in the bucket and look at the total numbers, the world is just barely hanging on, not seeing out of control growth, but not seeing recovery at this point either, not across the whole world. Some places recover, some are suffering, and in the middle we get this very mild trend. Okay, let's move on to the states of the United States. So the states of the United States are looking relatively bad compared to where they've been, but there's a real geographic distinction to be made here. As we'll see, actually, I'm going to pop over to the New York Times picture here. Again, I like the New York Times graphs, but this is an apolitical live stream. I'm not making any sort of a political statement by choosing a left-leaning media outlet for this. I'm just choosing it because I really like the way that they present their COVID data. And you can, I'm zoomed way in on this tiny graph here because if you actually click on the graph, you get all this great detail, but it misses the big trend. So this is actually my favorite graph from the New York Times right now, or favorite visualization. I don't do maps on my site, but they're certainly useful. And if you look at them, you can see it's all about the Dakotas and the surrounding area. Notice the West Coast is really very good. Red is bad, yellow is good. The East Coast is also really very good. Maybe North Carolina, not quite so good, but certainly the news is central northern. And so we can see that the Dakotas and Wisconsin, and let's see, I need to do my own geography lesson again, just to make sure that I got this as right as is that in fact Montana? I think it is. Yeah, Montana. So Montana is Montana is hit very badly. It's got small population, as do most of these. In Wisconsin, maybe not so much, but what we're seeing is a lot of the lesser populated states that really got by. They escaped the first wave, the main wave in the United States, the July wave. But then they are suddenly terrible, and we see this. The map speaks for itself. Also worth noting that two of the states that I focus on, the two that I live in, are California and Colorado. And Colorado, oddly, is surrounded by trouble on north and west and east and northeast, but it has mostly escaped being infected in this wave. Colorado's looking okay. So anyway, back to the states as I present them, which is time series graphs. Nice thing about the way that I do it here, though you don't see it in a geographic way, is you see it in a historical way. So we can see not just what's Montana look like now, but where has it been recently. And the New York Times graph doesn't show that, though they do have mini graphs that show that. But anyway, I like the comparison aspect of the way that I'm doing the graphs here. I'll keep doing them these ways, but I may pop over to the New York Times displays sometimes. So there was this crazy one here that I'm mostly going to ignore. Alabama shot to the stratosphere. Now it's back down into barely hotspot territory. I'm just going to ignore that. I don't think it was real. I think there is some catching up of data or something that made it shoot super high. But it is a hotspot, and indeed all 20 of the worst states in severity are severity hotspots. Severity, again, combines growth rate with daily cases per million. And so something tends to be severe if it is both high in number of cases in recent days and growing quickly in number of cases day over day. So Montana is actually the worst. South Dakota, Guam. Now, for reason, pretty much pretend that North Dakota is South Dakota. Those two are moving in lockstep at this moment. So North Dakota is probably around this green line here. The Dakotas are in terrible, terrible shape. They've got 700 in severity, and Montana as well. Guam, Wisconsin, also slightly good news here, at least, is that Wisconsin is improving in severity. It too was 700. Now it's down to 500. Again, it takes 200 to make it a hot spot. So it's very hot, but dropping. And we'll see more of that when we look at the growth rates. Utah, Idaho. This is just a list of the central northern states. United States has a wave locally in the central northern states. The country as a whole, actually I didn't even show us the United States. I'm going to go back to the countries really quick. How is the United States doing as a whole? Well, here it is. Not badly. The weekly growth rate of the United States is 3%. Again, 20 is bad. It's 3%. So it'd be great if we were shrinking, but we're not. And it looks kind of like what we saw of the world actually right now. The world has this flat, barely above zero mark. The United States the same. The United States as a whole is not experiencing a wave. It's barely growing, just barely ticking up there. But certain states absolutely are very hard hit. While states like California are recovering somewhat, and other states as well, states in the northern central areas of the country are growing at an epidemic exponential rate that's looking quite terrible, and the two pretty much balance each other out. So the United States as a whole is doing okay, but that's just because some places are doing quite well and other places are doing extraordinarily poorly. But bottom line of this graph is every one of the top 20 is severe, and north central is the problem location. West coast not, east coast not, north central. Let's look at the growth rates. So this, again, one of my favorite graphs, takes just the hottest in total cases and says, where are they headed? You can see things were a lot better in mid-September. Most of the current hottest states were shrinking. They were below that thick yellow horizontal line, the zero line. Back in September, they were shrinking. And then things went to hell. And by late September, we were in a full-blown wave of, this is, Wyoming, 60% growth rate. Wisconsin was 50, Utah's at 50, and almost all the states were above, especially right around here, around late September. Almost all of these states were growing. Now that's actually still true. If you look at the very latest, there are only 4 of them that are shrinking here now, but things look a little better than they did then. We definitely see a trend downward in the growth rates of most of these states. Most of these really hard hit states. You can just see this sense that most of the lines are angled downward. For instance, Wyoming, which used to be at 57% growth rate, is now at 25%. 25% growth rate is nothing to cheer about. It's above the 20% mark that I call bad. So certainly Wyoming is still very alarming in its growth rate, but it's better than it used to be. And as long as it continues this downward trend, it'll eventually hit zero and start shrinking, and things will be okay one day in Wyoming again. And we see this in a lot of these. Same thing for Nevada. What about the Dakotas, South Dakota? So if we look at South Dakota alone, South Dakota is kind of the poster child for this north central cluster. It was worse than it is now. It did trend downward from 50 to 20. It even now is below 20, which is good. It's not quite in the realm of really alarming, but there's not a sense looking at the graph now that it's headed downward. Maybe it's even headed upward again, just a barely bit, or maybe it's horizontal. So South Dakota has recovered in its growth rate, but it's still growing at 20% every week, which is quite bad, and it's not showing a sign towards recovery. So, and I kind of get that sense of this whole graph. There's a little bit of a hooking upwards from some of these, from maybe half of these, where they got a lot better. Let's take a look at another one, which is Mississippi. Mississippi, not in the center of our cluster. It's kind of one of the geographic outliers of that cluster, but it got up to 15, not too bad, but not what we want to see. And then it recovered almost all the way down to zero growth rate, and now it's hooked upwards just a little bit again, long enough that it's not just an outlier, not just one point pulling it upwards. Probably it really is showing an upward trend in growth rates, but it's still only at 7%, which is, we need to be below zero to get over this thing, but 7% is actually puts it in the lower half in terms of these top 20 states. So a lot of states doing quite poorly in growth rate. A lot of states above 0, 5 or so that are above 20, and then just a cluster of them between 0 and 20, which are not doing well enough. They're growing, but they're not growing too strongly in a sense that they may be showing a downward trend. Also worth noting maybe that back in, for instance, early October, just 10 days ago, there were a whole lot more states that were up above 20%. There were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what is it? Almost 10, maybe 10 states were above 20%. Now we only have 5 of them. Another indicator that there's a slight tilt towards the better. So this cluster of states certainly is having trouble, but it looks like it may be heading into less trouble. I have this up already because I was looking at it earlier, so I may as well keep it. The 2 states that I live in, California and Colorado, are both looking pretty good. California especially has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and ever since August. It's just never, it was shrinking much quicker before, negative 20% shrinkage rate, and it almost lost it all the way up to 0. Now it's shrinking at 3%. That's good enough. Any number below 0 is good enough. It'll eventually get us there, but it's a little disturbing that California was doing 20 and is now doing 3. There's certainly a medium-term trend upward, and it's plausible that California might burst through 0 and again start growing, but it hasn't yet. California, in spite of some of these hot spots we see, the central northern of the United States, California as a whole is doing good enough. Colorado not really doing good enough. It had a period also of 20% shrinkage, and then it lost it and had briefly 40%, a spike up to 40%. This is right when all its neighbors were becoming hotspots. But since then, for whatever reason, Colorado has managed to recover from that really bad 40% down to 5%. And so it's growing, but it's not growing by much, and its recent trend is sharply downward. So I hope we'll see Colorado get back down below 0 where it just was. To shout out to some of my loyal listeners in particular states, we've got Louisiana here doing okay. Looks kind of like California and Colorado, really, where it was down to a very nice 30% shrinkage rate. Lost it, went to 0, never really above 0. Recovered a little bit to 10 and is now headed back upwards, but still below 0. So Louisiana broadly is doing okay, but showing some alarming signs. It could be, though, as long as it stays below 0, everything's fine. It could be that it's going to be pulled upwards by the rest. In Texas, also showing much the same trend as the states we've just been talking about. Texas had a period of shrinkage. It was doing very well, and now it's up in the low single digits. And so it shows a short-term trend upwards. What else here? Is it worth looking at? I'm not going to do hospitalizations or deaths. Those tend to just follow the trends of, maybe look at test positivity. I'm curious about California's test positivity. Any number less than 10% means that a state is doing well, pretty well, in testing so much that it has a real fighting chance of keeping control of an epidemic. So here's California with its test positivity of less than 3%. That is very good. Now, compare with something like New York, who's had a real head start on it. The test positivity of New York is barely above 1%. It has been lower. New York has had 0.8%, but if we look at the total graph here again, numbers like 3% and 1%, those are great compared to the graph as a whole. We see places like Wyoming or Mississippi recognize these names from earlier in our lecture. Wyoming, Mississippi, which have positivity rates in the 10s, 40, 80% positivity rate. And this just means that these states are not testing enough to catch asymptomatic people. They're probably only testing when it really seems like there's a problem with a particular patient. They say, well, you might have coronavirus. Let's test you. And that's not good enough. It's not how New York stomped it out. It's not how California is stomping it out. The way that these states appear to have stomped it out is by testing people who they're pretty sure don't have the virus. You've got to test a lot of people who you're pretty sure don't have the virus, because then you catch these clusters. You nip them in the bud. When someone unexpected gets the virus, you find out as early as possible, and then you can contact trace or at least quarantine them. Okay, so this is such a messy graph. I'm gonna try to zoom in just to sort of get a sense of who's worst. Mississippi, Wyoming, New Jersey, that's actually completely unbelievable. I don't believe that number. New Jersey is probably about the same as New York. Something wrong in the data there. New Jersey really doesn't have a 36% positive. Maine, generally this data is not as reliable as the cases data. But the New York graph and the California graph I know to match other places I've seen. Wisconsin, Idaho, Montana. So in Montana actually isn't that bad right now. Let's look at North Dakota. North Dakota, we do actually have data for North Dakota here. Here's North Dakota, keeping a very consistent 7%. North Dakota actually isn't doing that badly. Let me zoom out. Aha, no. Yeah, North Dakota was doing pretty well. And of course, you will see a positivity rise if you have a fixed amount of testing and suddenly you have a spike of cases. You're going to be seeing more and more of them. So this graph will tend to rise when you have a wave. But let's see how South Dakota is doing. So North Dakota is not showing that. Yeah, that's more. South Dakota is more showing the trend that I was expecting, where you're just not doing enough testing and you'll get 50% positivity rate, as every state had at the very beginning when they just didn't have enough testing capacity to do widespread testing. But now we're doing widespread testing in certain places, and I suggest that is why, for instance, New York has not seen another wave. Let's look briefly at New York just to get a sense of whether it really has seen another wave, because we're getting some news out of New York suggesting that there are some problems there, but the problems are relative. New York does have problems. It was down in the 30s. It's not great in daily cases per million, but after its very high peak, it sort of got it under control. Again, we've seen 3 sometimes here as the number 3 daily cases per million. That's a good number. New York at 30 is okay. 100's a warm spot. And so now it's up to 70. And so New York is seeing a short-term rise. Maybe the beginning of a wave. My guess is not. My guess is that New York, obviously it's waving upwards, but my guess is we're going to see this stomped out because they're doing so much testing. And they're doing certain very proactive shutdowns of neighborhoods and so on, and businesses, to try to make sure that this little tick upwards doesn't become another 400. I'm guessing it won't even hit 100. And that's what we expect. That's what I expect. This metaphorical immune system thing I've talked about a lot, which is to say that regions metaphorically develop an immune response to the virus, in the sense that New York, having seen something like this, is in this never again mindset, where as soon as the virus peeks its head in again, it gets chopped off by all the responses that New York developed back in April. And people are much more serious about masks now, and we really, really believe they work. And people are serious about lockdowns. And I think that New York and most other states that have had it really bad won't see another wave because they've had it really bad, and because they have all the mechanisms in place to control it. This especially will be true if they continue to do widespread testing after their wave recedes. And New York certainly has done that, as we can see from their very low test positivity rate. On the other hand, I need to take at least a brief look at this graph. Time was when I was saying, this is the graph that shows what happens after a state gets warm. The first time a state ever gets warm, it tends to rise to its peak for about 30 days, drop from its peak, and never have a peak again. Now, we used to see that Louisiana was an exception to that. And I sort of waved that away for a while, said, Louisiana is just a weird exception, had other excuses. At this point, we're seeing a lot of exceptions. There may still, I think there's arguably still a trend among most states that once they've had it, they don't get it again. But if you look at, for instance, Montana, Wisconsin, this new wave, Utah, Nebraska, and South Dakota, let's just focus on those and say, is it really true that once a state has had it, it doesn't get it again? Nebraska, and while we're at it, we'll put in Louisiana. Dakotas. Utah in there, I think. All right, so here are some of them. So these are all, at first glance, counter examples to that theory I have that once a state has it, it never gets it again. Because they all hit 100 back whenever, and they went typically up from there, and then they seemed like they got better, and now they have what looks like a new wave. So whatever, maybe the theory is just plain wrong, but on the other hand, if you look at something like Montana, I would say that Montana never had a strong wave like they had the first time. This is especially true of Montana. It's hard to say, well, Montana already had its wave. On the other hand, by my original definition, reaching 100 makes a wave, so maybe. But what I like to hope, what I still hope, and maybe this is just a fool's dream at this point, I like to hope that Montana is having a wave now because it never really developed an immune response to one. It's also probably having a wave now because it has some cultural differences with some of the other states that have had a wave. I do believe that there's a sense that the northern central states tend to be more swashbuckling. We don't need no masks in their approach to the virus. But I have a feeling, and I think there have been a lot of states, the South and Texas and so on, and really every state that had a little bit of a sense of that and has since had it scared out of them. And so I think that Montana, which is now having an extreme wave, is going to come to its senses. I don't really know whether those folks out in Montana are now masking up and socially distancing and doing all the things that the rest of the country that's gotten over it have done. But if they are, in testing, putting state resources towards testing, if they are, then they'll peak, they'll drop away. They will peak and drop away regardless. But the thesis is, having peaked and dropped away, they'll never come back this strong again. And so there aren't many exceptions to that, even among these supposed exceptions. You can see a significant wave in Nebraska, but it was mild compared to the current one. You can see a very significant wave in Louisiana, but again, we've talked about how that was New Orleans, and this is not New Orleans. New Orleans got it, and then later a different area got it, so maybe we can explain it that way. But something like South Dakota really never had it. It's especially compared to now, when it's at 600, it really never had it. It was just wiggling around 100 for a while. And so this is its first wave. In the cases of Nebraska, Louisiana, and Utah, we could argue pretty strongly that they're in their second wave now. The other ones, not so much. So some states may indeed have a second wave. Most haven't. And with a really strong second wave, I'm hoping they will develop that kind of immunity, so we won't see a third wave from them, or a wave as strong as this. So as we continue to collect data, I'm weakening in my certainty of the metaphorical immune system hypothesis, we are seeing states, some states, a few states, showing behavior that suggests that even though they had it reasonably bad, they got it again. And so, and certainly in Europe, we see this as well. It can happen. My hope is that having had it badly, most regions will be on guard and will be able to stomp it down quickly if it comes back. And that's what I'm really hoping to see in New York State. Here we are, right at the beginning of what could be another terrible wave in New York. Will it be with a 1% positivity testing rate? I don't think so. They're going to be finding so many cases there early on that I don't think they're ever going to be able to run away into the 400s again. But we'll see. All right, let's move on to the counties. Counties of California. This is actually another great place to bring back the New York Times thing. This time I'm going to show it in its full detail glory. This is actually a granularity of better than county. If you pick a particular thing, it often selects, like here. It actually does select a county, but only the whole county isn't colored one particular way. It shows exactly where in the county the cases occurred. Now, Wisconsin is just ridiculous. I know I'm supposed to talk about California here, but here we are in the counties. So I just want to take a brief look. If you look, and this is part of the reason I don't like this view for getting a big look, is it's not clear that North Dakota and South Dakota have a problem, because there's so much gray space. It looks like no problem. And this is because they are doing a much finer granularity than individual counties. They're breaking down to precinct or something. And so, but when you look at the state level, North Dakota, South Dakota are solid red. And if you look here, you can see what they really are is a bunch of very red dots. And so this report doesn't show very well for some reason. I guess it's just because the population centers are far apart. It doesn't show obviously that North and South Dakota are the worst, but they are. In Wisconsin, then, due to some political subdivision aspect, probably is showing much more solid red, but it's really no worse, or not much worse, than North and South Dakota. But still, if we look at these, for instance, looking at Oconto County, Wisconsin, sort of at random, you can see the cases per 100,000 are 129, which in my terminology is 1,290 daily cases per million. That is an extraordinarily high number. Remember, 200 is a hot spot. This is at 1,290, and we see a lot of these as we look around Wisconsin. So Wisconsin is terrible. But back to topic, if we look at, okay, can I zoom? Yeah. If we look at, let me make sure that you're actually seeing what I'm seeing. Yes, you are. This is good enough. If we look at California, there's a lot of nice light yellow. There are a few, there's no red. There's no red in California. There is no county or even sub-county region that is a hot spot in California. We have a few places like Sonoma right now, Shasta, Los Angeles is a little bit not so great, Monterey, but even Monterey at 99 per million is not quite a warm spot. So even this color doesn't indicate warm spot. Now, Sonoma is a warm spot, 160 per million. Just multiply by 10 to go from New York Times version to my version. 160 per million is a warm spot, but not a hot spot. San Diego is not even a warm spot. Riverside is barely a warm spot. San Bernardino, barely a warm spot. Los Angeles. And so you see the trend here. When you look over to Utah, for instance, and see these terrible red, we don't have that in California. California is looking good. California is not over it, but mostly it's not even warm. So that's nice. And as we saw, it's still shrinking. So from this place of not too bad, it's going very slightly towards even better. By the way, looking in Colorado here, you can see Larimer County, where I spend part of my time, is a warm spot, 150, not a hot spot. And Colorado as a whole, not too bad. But it's worse than California. We have, what is this one? We have an actual hot spot in Adams County, and Grand Canyon is quite hot, but mostly the whole West kind of has this sense of things are okay here. Nevada and Arizona and Oregon and Washington, all of the Pacific Coast states are doing okay. And California is one of those. So good news for California. Now, by county, if we break it down, again, the nice thing about my report is it shows not just where we are, but where we've been, and sometimes where we're going. Tehama, for some reason, was terrible, shrinking down into no longer being a hot spot. And again, here we see, even in severity, which tends to be a little bit higher than daily cases per million because it tends to have a multiplying factor attached to it, there are no hot spots here. Maybe just barely Tehama, but you can see it's headed downward. There are no hot spots. We have a few warm spots and these are the very worst counties of California, the worst ones. A few warm spots, Sonoma, Kings never seems to quite get over it. I think it has a prison. Riverside, Los Angeles even, right on the edge of warm spot. It is technically a warm spot, but just barely. But you can also see some of these are trending downward. Los Angeles, if we look at where it's headed, Los Angeles used to be just terrible. I mean, we can look at how Los Angeles used to be. It was just the reason that California had cases for a while there. Everyone else was noise. Now, and it was at 450 daily cases per million, and it has recovered very nicely down to the 60s range, which is, we still want to have it down really in the 1 digits. So this is still, we have an epidemic in California. No time to relax. This is no time to relax. But it did very strongly recover, Los Angeles. And then it's lost a little bit of its momentum and is back into low warm spot range. So Los Angeles isn't looking great, but it's not looking very bad either. And neither is anyone. We don't have Imperial shooting into the stratosphere anymore. We don't have, where is Imperial? It had such a bad time of it. 2,500 in severity. Now here it is down at 150. Kings as well. 2,000 severity, and then another spike at 1,000, down to 100 something. So California is looking much better than it was. And it's still kind of bad. We still have a lot of cases and every potential of them blowing up into another wave if we don't stay vigilant. But it's better. So it's a lot better than it has been, and it's very slightly shrinking. Let's look at that. Speaking of shrinking, one final thing we'll look at here before I finish up. What are the growth rates? My favorite graph. This shows the hottest states, counties, the hottest counties in daily cases per million. Where are they trending? I'm going to zoom in really far here just to get an even closer look. So here's the 0 line. Only six of them are growing of the top 20 worst. Sonoma's growing, Tehama, Yuba, Tulare, Riverside, Stanislaus, and just barely Los Angeles. Just barely, right around 0. Los Angeles is a warm spot and stable, which is not good, but it's ever so much better than it used to be. The rest of these worst hit states counties are shrinking. On the other hand, however, there's not a clear downward trend to this graph. Zooming out again. Yes, most of them are shrinking, but we sometimes see that most of them are trending downward in their growth rates. Certainly Tehama is, but mostly I'd say if there were a trend in this graph, it's more often upward than not. Maybe 50-50 actually. About half of these are trending upward and half of them are trending downward in growth rates. And we have at least these 3, Yuba, Tulare, and Stanislaus, which are positive growth rates and trending upward, the two things we don't like to see. But at least they don't have the third, which is that they don't have a very high growth rate. Their growth rates are 6% per week right now. Not great, but not hot, not a hot growth hotspot. So these are that we could see a problem arising from here. Right now, this is just kind of a snarl with no particular direction to it. But the good thing about this graph is that most of them are below the zero line. Most counties are shrinking. And this is why we're seeing generally California is mostly shrinking. So California is balancing on an edge right now, around zero growth, a little below zero growth. Could go either way. It still has quite a lot of cases, somewhere in the realm of warm spot or almost in terms of cases. Really hard to say where it's going to go. It certainly has the pressure of that central northern United States cluster. That cluster, I think, is since it's so hot, it is kind of pressing all the other states in the upward direction. When you have 1,000 daily cases per million in Wisconsin, anyone who ever flies from Wisconsin is likely to slightly increase the odds of wherever they go of having cases, because they're more likely than those places to have the coronavirus. So we're in a delicate place right now in the United States. A lot of states rising very quickly. Some, like California, shrinking slowly. Some are maybe 20 or so, 25 are shrinking reasonably well, but we're really just balanced at this point. The good news about that is we're not seeing an overall epidemic. All we're seeing is regional epidemics balanced by regional shrinkage in other regions. But the bad news is we are, on a whole, not getting better in the United States. So I'll keep watching this. I'll keep doing these things. I hope to make another blog one of these days. But obviously, it's not over. And so I will keep reporting on it until it's over, or until it's so close to over that everyone is feeling reasonably comfortable about it. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for watching.